So here's the thing, it seems like every time a new movie by Quentin Tarantino comes along and puts its dick on the table, you get at least a few politically uptight moralists looking for an excuse to condemn his work as mere sensationalist schlock, disguised as this rebellious middle finger within the Hollywood system that falls apart once you suck all the style and attitude out of it. But then conversely, you also have a rabid fanbase of edgy nerds that glorify him as cinema's modern pop art icon, as if he actually led a rebellion within the Hollywood studio system with the whole style is the substance shtick. And sure, there's definitely aspects of these two different sentiments I agree with, but I think both parties are equally guilty of sometimes taking his films out of context and over-politicizing them, kinda like what this will inevitably be, when that isn't Tarantino's intended purpose. He simply wants to make fun, enjoyable, heavily indulgent celebratory films, not have people question morality or introspect on the state of the world.
Why the need for so much gruesome, graphic violence? Why not let us imagine?
Because it's so much fun, Jan! Get it?
The hype behind the guy is both the best and worst thing he has going for him, because on the one hand, the hype helps sell his films as these major lavish Hollywood spectacles, but on the other hand, it calls so much attention to itself in the process that it becomes an easy target for criticism.
And I'm shutting your butt down.
Despite his most recent film being described as possibly his most grounded, sensitive, and mature film of his career, it was still met with its own fair share of controversy thanks to its surprisingly revisionist climax that, according to its most vocal critics, contradicts everything I just described. But what if I was to say that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was actually Tarantino's most complex, meaningful, and misunderstood film of his entire career? So let's talk about it. So here's the thing, I wouldn't classify Once Upon a Time in Hollywood as this buddy comedy like everyone seems to describe it as. I would actually call it a fantasy. Not so much in the traditional sense, but in the thematic sense. I mean, the title does kind of give it away. It's a play on classical Hollywood's fairy tale-like approach to storytelling, where everything always works itself out in the end, which is exactly how this film plays out, but we'll come back to that later. To put this into context, Once Upon a Time is set at the very end of the golden age of Hollywood in 1969, an era which began in the 1910s and encapsulated not just the development of movie-making continuity, but manifested cinema as a welcome escapism during dire political, economic, and social unrest, such as the War and the Great Depression. We could talk forever about what it meant for filmmaking, but what matters more is what it represented culturally for audiences as a way of obtaining respite from all the difficulties and horrors of everyday life, way before we started finding some sort of sadistic comfort in misery porn following post-war anxieties. The point was, Hollywood was once an absolute idealistic fantasy detached from any sort of realism. It departed as far as it could from real-world tragedy and transgression, using the illusion that good things will always come to those who deserve it, while the bad guys will get their comeuppance. It rewarded good behaviour and punished the bad. People related to the idea that their struggles could one day lead to that elusive happily ever after. It was a false tradition many people were raised to subconsciously believe, but unfortunately in real life that's just not how things work. We don't live in a meritocracy, but we do live with this shred of hope that good will one day triumph over evil, which it occasionally has, despite the copious amounts of crap that gets thrown at us on a regular basis. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood pretty much follows this exact classical structure. It sets up Rick Dalton as a down-on-his-luck actor trying to revitalize his career, and Cliff Booth as a happy-go-lucky misfit who helps Rick see the brighter side of life despite having his own admittedly depressing one, eventually bringing them together to unite against a common evil,
bunch of goddamn fucking hippies,
save the day, and now the heroic Rick being invited back into the Hollywood spotlight. Except, in reality, as we all know, the bad guys technically won. Yeah, I am aware that was a pretty tasteless way to describe it, but while the film is not historically accurate in the slightest, it is somewhat symbolically accurate in what it's meant to represent. I think most of us are generally familiar with the Manson family and their extremely brief, if impactful, reign of terror during the 1960s, but for those unfamiliar, as a brief summary, Charles Manson was a psychopathic hippie who hated hippies and managed to convince a bunch of low-life rejects who were not hippies but clearly were hippies that he was more or less the second coming of Jesus, and manipulated them, according to one major theory, into allegedly trying to start a race war, leading to 9 sadistically gruesome murders, 6 of which, including 8-month pregnant Sharon Tate, happening on the same night that Once Upon a Time in Hollywood's climax takes place. I bet you can't guess how many takes that took. The Manson family became an immediate and terrifying news story that effectively ignited a turning point in American society's perception towards domestic unrest and random acts of violence. Despite a war that showed the cruel and savage nature of humanity, it was the Manson family that showed the world that that very nature also existed right outside our very front door. Today, it's not as distinctly terrifying because every other day we hear of something horrific accentuated by media that relies on fear-mongering to get our attention in a world that's become so fast-paced and competitive, similar to what Hollywood has become in the eyes of Rick, that we've somewhat resigned ourselves to it. But the emphasis that Tarantino draws on is that this very event, in the context of Hollywood, led to a stark change in mood at the beginning of the 70s. Remember that misery porn I mentioned earlier? Well, from the 70s, films became a lot more cynical to reflect the fears of domestic life. In fact, the horror genre became immensely prominent during the era that slashers and movies inspired by human phobias were stamping their place in cinema history, many of which were met with critical backlash for being deliberately depraved and provocative, which, again, is an attitude that's meant to be indicative of the ending. When people say Once Upon a Time is a love letter to Hollywood, I feel that's just the surface to it. But I do highly recommend the video essay by The Discarded Image on Tarantino's meta approach to the story that points out dozens of intelligent observations that I never considered. Once Upon a Time in the eyes of Tarantino is a bittersweet tale about the end of an era, one that at first is characterized by Rick Dalton's growing irrelevancy, but ultimately in the wider spectrum of the world, his problems are, well, irrelevant to everything else that's going on around him. The major cause of complaint was that, in this unexpected twist, the Manson family are defeated and gruesomely destroyed by Cliff and Rick in a comedically over-the-top fashion that seemed to demean the tragedy of what happened and appears insensitive to the victims, even though Tate's husband and sister were given the script by Tarantino to reassure them of what he was attempting to do. While I understand where the dislike comes from, it does seem reactionary without addressing Tarantino's intent, which, to be fair, is not necessarily something you're going to pick up on in the initial viewing. I mean, I'm coming from my research perspective of the time period in context to the rise of the horror genre, so obviously I have a very niche specific perception on where I think Tarantino is coming from. But staying on topic, for a guy so unflinchingly outspoken about his love and ideology of cinema, which he practically treats like a religion, it doesn't make sense to me that people would criticize him as being deliberately tasteless, especially when he gained the reassurance of Tate's sister, who was initially very negative towards the idea. It's just Tarantino's weird, eccentric way of paying tribute, you could say. It's just his typical abstract revenge porn that gives a massive fuck you to the Mansons, with a gratifying payoff that, as I'll come to explain later, somewhat critiques violence. I see the ending as upholding the Hollywood fantasy and giving us catharsis for the characters we come to know and love. Sure, some say giving Sharon Tate very little screen time was questionable, but it's actually a matter of less being more. As Tarantino himself describes, she died so young that we had very little time to spend with her, and her legacy was how infectiously joyous and passionate she was for life. And you do get that from Margot Robbie's performance. Sure, she's just smiling and dancing most of it, but it's symbolic of Hollywood's cult of personality. She's hypnotically engaging to watch, in the same way Cliff and Rick are. So, to a certain degree, the movie has a partial mood piece quality to it. It reflects the lifestyle of living moment to moment that was prevalent in the more increasingly liberal 60s American culture. Take the fact that like a third of the movie is driving sequences that have a sort of liberating and exhilarating feel to them. On paper, it does sound boring, but you're so absorbed into the same hypnotic bubble as the characters. Like Sharon, our love for Rick and Cliff is so infectious that we are conditioned to believe in their perception of the world, reliable or not, like a positive alternative to Manson and his followers. But the thing is, everyone is so consumed by the allure of all the lights and signs that they ignore the evil that's always looming in the background. It might not be the story's internal conflict, that being largely Rick struggles to survive Hollywood, but it is a conflict in the greater scope of Hollywood, which itself, as cliched as it's going to sound, is essentially the main character of the story. As I said, the film is about the death of an era in Hollywood, with the commitment to the fantasy being the catharsis and escapism we want from cinema, even if it is not true. For all its celebration, it also has its own criticisms to Hollywood. Rick's recurring existential crisis about his career is a pure reflection of Hollywood's self-obsession. Hell, Sharon Tate even goes to literally watch herself in her own movie. Everyone in the film is living in their own personal fantastical illusion, allowing the evil to manifest its way through Hollywood, which becomes a problem that's ignored until it's too late. It is fairly open about Hollywood just ignoring its own problems, like how Cliff's mysterious past where he's rumoured to have killed his own wife is never fully addressed, which itself is a play on the real-life event where actress Natalie Wood drowned during a boat trip, but conflicting witness accounts made it difficult to determine what actually happened. I would even argue the film takes a few jabs at Polanski's interest in younger girls, and on a lighter side we have Bruce Lee being a high and mighty douchebag as perceived by Cliff, and then we see Rick trying to desperately ignore his career regrets, like losing the lead role in The Great Escape to Steve McQueen. For how wholesome the film can be at times, it does embrace the dark side more frequently than not. In fact, I find myself weirdly comparing the film to Damien Chazelle's La La Land, which I also think is a film that's been heavily misinterpreted because I feel it's a much more cynical film that's all about the illusion of Hollywood's magical star-studded glamour, when in reality it's a cesspit of grinding cutthroat competition, heartbreak, and things that Hollywood filmmakers are obviously going to omit because you can't bite the hand that feeds. Ironically, to which Once Upon a Time was the first Tarantino film without Harvey Weinstein's involvement for this exact reason. I guess to an extent you could argue that the film is somewhat hypocritical at times, but nonetheless the film is always about trapping you and alluring you within the Hollywood bubble that everyone wanted to be a part of, including Manson himself, that it distracts you from all the real danger that's hiding in plain sight. In the back of your mind, you know something bad is coming, and you're cynically resigned to it because with how much cinema has changed over the years, we're more desensitized to bad things just happening. Movies have taught us that some things are just too good to be true, so when the reverse actually happens and the heroes save the day, there's a greater emotional release. And the characters even end up rewarded for it. The Tate murders never happen, so Hollywood doesn't enter the dark era, and Rick has a chance to revive his career, hence it's an extremely happy fairy tale ending, or at least a happy ending in quite a twisted sense. That haunting image has been permanently burnt into my skull, no pun intended. So it's nothing new to say that people always get way too angsty about Tarantino's use of violence as if it's something incredibly provocative and something different that we've never seen before, so much so that he's had to defend himself on multiple occasions, and it was only a matter of time that he'd make a film that's actually a pretty honest self-critique of his career. While it shouldn't sound surprising given we're talking about Tarantino of all people, violence is a very prominent motif throughout the film. Rick's entire career is centered around escapism that uses violence as the release, and when discussing his future with a casting agent, he comes to the same conclusion. We love how he kind of comes to represent how drawn we are to violence in fiction. In the words of the casting agent, he has a powerful psychological effect on the audience. The point becomes that violence is a major component to escapism. Despite it being this nasty, horrifying act, it's ironically a hell of a lot of fun to watch. Case in point, the ending of the film.
Is that why you think people like watching violent movies? People who are not violent people, or twisted people in any way, but why it's okay to go into a movie and enjoy the violence?
Yeah, well, it's a movie. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy. It's not real life.
As the film shows through Rick's interactions, we don't like nasty violence, we like indulgent violence. And when you consider the trajectory of Tarantino's work, the violence has gotten progressively unrealistic and exists purely for gratification. Hell, it's practically a punchline when you think about it.
How you like that? You bushwhacking cat straight up?
At first, the approach to the film's violence is that fiction is innocuous. If anything, it brings people together in front of the warm glow of a screen to unite against a common enemy that our hero can destroy. Yet, when the Mansons come along, suddenly violence has an unwanted, vicious impact. The reason the killers decide to go after Rick instead is because they want to use him as their statement towards how Hollywood inspired their bloodlust. In their words, let's kill the people who taught us to kill. They treat Rick as a sort of inadvertent scapegoat, that he's somehow responsible in their eyes. He's essentially a killer living in luxury, even though he's completely oblivious to what's going on. It's a weird twist on how he didn't actually kill anyone, but he somehow inspired it, kinda like how Manson never successfully committed murder, but obviously inspired it to his followers, at least according to them. This then plays into how the brutal encounter plays out. It's supposed to be over the top and borderline cartoonish. It's an emotional release on evil to let the audience cheer for the heroes, calling on the storytelling of the era. It might seem like an abrupt tonal shift for some, but it's all evidently leading this way. The fact several critics condemned it as senseless and out of touch with the rest of the film is completely the opposite to how I saw it, because the film is so thematically built around it, and how the disgust of the violence mirrors that of the Manson family murders. It does infer to a deep-rooted hypocrisy within media. If it played out exactly what happened, how would the reaction differ? Would it be perceived as somewhat now acceptable because it's true to the reality, or would it still be condemned by some because people are sensitive to violence in any context? That's how I saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood as one of the more unique portrayals of violence. It highlights an ignorance when fiction meets reality, an inherent cynicism where some of the most cherished and beloved works of fiction are filled with violence and conflict, even though people love to debate that violence and conflict are actually a problem within media and fiction. It's a part of our nature, and film, media, and fiction in general have conditioned us to see it in two distinctly contrasting and contradicting ways. Violence in cinema is always a lose-lose. It's a disturbing, unpleasant, unwanted act that can somehow be molded into a context where we can find joy and comfort in it. But no matter how real it aims to be, it will never be that, because you can't feel the same horrors of reality when you're protected by the sanctuary of your own screen.
Is everybody okay?
Well, the fucking hippies aren't.